Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Marcus Point Baptist Church. And more specifically, welcome to the Spirit of Christmas. How many are glad to be here this morning? Now, I need you to do me a favor real quick, okay? I need you to just stop, take a deep breath. For real. Take a really deep breath. Y'all ready? Now just take a look around you. You may have your husband or your wife sitting by you. Maybe your family is right there, or your friends. Or maybe you've come alone. But all of us today are surrounded by people who love us. Aren't you glad for that? Yeah. Well, the Bible says, for where two or three gather in my name, there am I with them. So even if you came alone today, none of us are truly alone, because Jesus is here. Church, can I say that again? Jesus is here today. And that's the message of the Christmas story. Emmanuel, God with us. He is here. And it's our desire today that you experience him in an amazing, unique, even a personal way. We've got some amazing music today played by some of the region's best musicians and singers. We have an unbelievable speaker. And church, we're even gonna feed you for free. So sit back and breathe it all in. Now, I asked for one favor. I'm gonna ask for one more. We're gonna start the music off today by featuring none other than you. All right, so before any of this team sings behind me, I want you to sing. But I don't sound good. Listen, that doesn't matter. So go ahead and tell the person beside you, it doesn't matter how I sound, I'm gonna sing. Tell them. In the words of the great Buddy the Elf, the best way to spread Christmas cheer is what? So now take your cell phones, all right? Take your cell phones, and I want you to put them in airplane mode. And then after that, I want you to throw your lights on. Everybody in the place, get your cell phone out. It's been controlling you all year. Now you're gonna control it right now. Turn it into a candle this morning, and everybody get that light on in the place. Shine your lights, and let's sing all together. You're gonna sing first, okay? As we begin, Spirit of Christmas 2021. Let's go. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Let me hear you sing. Sleep in heavenly peace. You sing. Now make welcome to the stage Marcus Point Worship. Silent night, holy night, shepherds wait at the sun. Glory streams from heaven above. Heavenly hosts sing hallelujah. Come on, church. Christ the Savior is born. You sing. Now he's no stranger to us. Put your hands together for Dwayne Crocker Jr. Come on. Holy, holy, hope in a manger for you and for me. Bow down You heard him a little earlier, but make welcome back to the stage on the sax, Udiel Vega. All right, now you've met us. Now forget about us and get on your feet and let's worship the only one that matters today. His name is Jesus. Hope in a manger for you and for me. Just bow down and all right, don't sit down. Y'all stay up. Here we go. Hey! While shepherds kept them watching over silent flocks by night, behold, throughout the Come on, this is a church service, so stand on your feet and let's worship God together today. Come on. Go tell it on the mountain, the one that we've been waiting for, the King of our salvation. Born on this day, our Savior Christ the Lord. Sing it with us. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and every way, that we can be forgiven. The weight of all our sin, He came to bear. Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel, King Jesus, the Savior of the world is born. Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel, King Jesus, the Savior of the world is born. Go tell it on the mountain, humbly in a manger laid, mercy sent from heaven, angels fill the sky with highest praise. Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel, King Jesus, the Savior of the world is born. Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel, King Jesus, the Savior of the world is born. Go tell it on the mountain, this baby born of virgin birth, the ruler of all nations, the glory of our God has come to earth. Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel, King Jesus, the Savior of the world is born. Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel, King Jesus, the Savior of the world is born.
Clap your hands like this. Come on. Come on. Can you feel it in the air? Joy is everywhere. It's Christmas. Everything is shining bright. Oh, what a glorious night. It's Christmas. It's the greatest time of the year. Come on, clap those hands. Hey. It's the greatest time of the year. Y'all ready to dance? Come on. Come on, let's celebrate. It's Christmas. So be of good cheer. 'Cause Jesus is near. Come on, let's celebrate. It's Christmas. So everybody sing. Let the music ring. It's
There is a reason why we celebrate tonight. It's Jesus, the greatest gift of all. He came to save us all. He's Jesus, and it's Christmas. It's the greatest time of the year. It's the greatest time of the year.
Come on, let's celebrate. It's Christmas. Be of good cheer. Jesus is here. Come on, let's celebrate. It's Christmas. So everybody sing. Let the music ring. It's Christmas. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Oh. Come on, let's celebrate. Come on, let's celebrate. It's Christmas. Be of good cheer. Jesus is here. Come on, let's celebrate. It's Christmas. So everybody sing. Let the music ring. It's Christmas. It's Christmas. Oh, yeah. It's Christmas. It's
Kaylee, listen to this. A Harvard graduate. I didn't know anything good could come out of Harvard. Did you? Harvard graduate. Georgetown graduate. Incredible. She's got degrees in political science. Of course, she was on the Trump campaign and his press secretary. Now she's co-hosting Outnumbered. You see her every day on Outnumbered. And we've seen her over and over again on Fox News and Hannity and all these different places. She's written a new book, and I think it has a great title. It comes from the book of Esther, For Such a Time as This. Wow, couldn't be a greater title for such a time as this, because we need people right now representing Jesus at this time in our world, such a time as this. We're so honored to have Kaylee McEnany as our guest today. Welcome her to Pensacola and to Marcus Point. Come on, Kaylee.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Wow. What a Christmas celebration. I mean, the truck outside was, first of all, phenomenal. The Delta Force truck, and then Dwayne's beautiful music. Well, I've been so blessed to be in the house of the Lord this morning here at Marcus Point Baptist Church in Pensacola. So thank you all so much for having me. Pastor Godfrey, what a blessing you and your family are. So thank you. Well, starting out, a lot, I think, has changed in the last year since I left the podium. One of the biggest things that I think has changed are the questions coming from reporters. And it's Sunday morning, it's not Saturday night. The questions I'm going to read to you right now are not SNL, they're not parody, they are in fact questions asked of the White House press corps over the last 10 months. And I think it says a lot about how the demeanor, at least among the media, has changed. This was one of the first questions that the media decided to ask day one press briefing out of the gate. You'd think they'd have hard-hitting questions for the American people, but the question was this: could you just give us some color about what it was like for Joe Biden to walk into the Oval Office? He's been waiting for this for so long. What was his reaction? I would have loved a question like that. I never got it, but I would have loved it. Then there was, will Joe Biden keep Donald Trump's Air Force One color scheme change? Another great question. I'm sure we were all wondering. Then there was this: can you clarify for us what happened with the president's dog? There's some reports that one of them was involved in a biting incident. Whoa. And then my personal favorite, what about the White House cat? So these were questions. You compare that to some of the questions I was asked, they were a bit different in tone. Let me ask, if I can, Kaylee, why does the president keep hiring people who are dumb as a rock, overrated, way over their heads, wacko, and incompetent? Yeah. Good one. Then there was, so you've used the phrase warriors to describe everyday Americans fighting the pandemic. The president's using that phrase as well. What was the thinking behind using that description? Is he basically asking Americans to put themselves in harm's way like warriors do? No, I think he's just praising the American people for fighting COVID-19, but okay. And then there was the question where you could see me flipping through my binder, and I literally stop. I went and watched the video, and my face looks up in utter bewilderment, and I just stare blankly because this was the question. Does President Trump believe that it was a good thing that the South lost the Civil War? That was a question asked by a White House reporter. I think the answer to that is obvious. But anyway, a lot has changed. But that being said, let me backtrack a little and talk about getting the job as press secretary, because it was a tremendous honor. It was during COVID-19. It was the beginning of last year. We were all locked down. As you can attest here, it's, at least if you're locked down, it's good to be locked down in Florida so you can go to the beach. So I was locked down in Florida with my family. I grew up in Plant City, Florida, went to Southern Baptist Church and went to the all-girls Catholic school in Tampa. So we ended up moving to Tampa, and we're locked down there. And, we had just come off the campaign trail. So my daughter, baby Blake, who's here, you might have seen her in the pew, we'd taken her to Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, and we'd been all over the country. My mom and I disassembling strollers in the airport, taking wheels off. It was treacherous at times, but a lot of fun. And then we went into lockdown mode. And I'm locked down at my house, and this came as a bit of a surprise, this phone call. My daughter's in the back seat, my mom's driving. I'm trying to keep my daughter quiet with a pacifier because my phone lights up, and it's this odd set of numbers. And when you see an odd set of numbers, it's usually the White House switchboard. And everyone thinks, oh, Kaylee, you knew President Trump well when you became press secretary, but I actually didn't. We had spoken a few times. I'd seen him on the campaign trail as his campaign press secretary, but I didn't know him very, very well. So this number calls, and I think, okay, this is one of a handful of calls I've ever received from the president. He's probably just going to say, great job on this media appearance you did, or something of that nature. But not this time. He called, I answered, keeping Blake quiet, and he says, I have a question for you. And I said, what's that, Mr. President? And he said, would you like to be my White House press secretary? And I said, Mr. President, that would be the honor of my lifetime. To which he responded something to the effect of, Mark, get it done. And I think he meant, Mark Meadows, go get it done. And it took a few weeks, but indeed he got it done, and it was surreal. I had been a White House intern, so I interned for the Bush administration, and I'd seen Dana Perino give a press briefing, and I'm in the back of the room, intrigued by the White House press briefing, never knowing that more than 10 years later, I would be the one to take to that podium. It was something that I never really had strongly desired, but when I got into politics, I decided that was a job I wanted to pursue, and indeed, I got the job. But upon taking the job, a few realities set in. First, leaving my daughter, because I'd be leaving her behind in Florida to go up to DC, and it was in the middle of COVID. I didn't know when I would see her. She was about 5 months at the time. And I was so sad to leave her, and I remember just days before we left, I started to cry, and I'm holding her in my arms, and literally physical tears were dropping on her little, beautiful body and her soft skin, and at that point, my tears are falling on my daughter, and she lights up with her very first smile. And I know it was her way of saying, Mommy, go do this, and it was God's way of saying, I want you to go do this. But I was still nervous. Answering questions during COVID-19, a lot of uncertainty there, and I didn't know if I could do the job. And, I'm driving up the Eastern Corridor, riding rather. My husband drove me in his black Ford truck up the Eastern Corridor. We didn't want to be caught on a plane. We thought the press would say, Kaylee, caught on a plane during COVID, so we just thought we'd play it safe and drive up. We made the drive. And I'm on the way up, madly researching how to be a good press secretary, reading academic journal articles, studying. And then my dad sent me that sage advice, which was this. He said, maybe you were made, quote, for such a time as this. The words from Esther 4:14. Now, Esther, of course, saved the Jewish people. I'm not in any way suggesting I'm going to do anything as historically significant or momentous or important as that, but I believe that message was a message I was meant to hear and that we're all meant to hear. And I know I was meant to hear it because sometimes people ask me, how do you know God is real? And one of the ways I know Jesus Christ is Savior and God is indeed real is through duplication. When you receive a message two different ways, through two different people, the exact same message. And indeed, that's exactly what happened to me. Literally 3 weeks later, it was a Democrat commentator from CNN, Van Jones, who's a man of faith as well, a believer. He sent me separately, Kaylee, you were made, quote, for such a time as this. And it was God's way, I know, of saying, you can do this despite your nervousness. So I moved forward, and, I said I could do this. I've got Christ on my side despite the nerves. And I was very nervous. I remember my first day was April 13th, 2020, my first day on the job as press secretary. It was unbelievable. I walked through the rain that day. It wasn't the way you wanted to start your first job. I showed up in the press secretary's office absolutely drenched. But I was okay. I got my act together and started my first day. And Mark Meadows, who also is a believer and a man of faith, was instrumental in helping to give me the courage that first day to get through and days thereafter. And he called me. He said later that day, Kaylee, come to the Oval Office. The president's going to do a coronavirus task force briefing. You guys may remember those. It was like President Trump here, and then Dr. Fauci contradicting him often, and Dr. Birx. Yes, so I go into the Oval to prepare the president, and it was amazing. I walk in, there's this beautiful mahogany grandfather clock to the left, and I walk across the sunbeam pattern rug from the Reagan administration that President Trump repurposed for his Oval Office. And I sit on these gold couches right across from the president. He's behind the Resolute desk, which was a gift to the United States back in the 1800s from Queen Victoria. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is amazing. I'm going to brief the President of the United States before a briefing. And I realized the key to being a good press secretary, one, of course, to do a good job at the podium yourself, but is to know how to prepare your boss. And as I watched the president prepare, he read through his scripted opener a lot. It was much like this, a little binder with his scripted opener. He didn't practice a lot of the question and answer, so it didn't leave me a lot of time to prepare him. I'm watching him. He's reading his remarks. He'd take a Sharpie. He'd mark through certain things. He'd rip pages that he didn't like. At one point, I think I even saw him cut a piece off. And I thought, this is fun to watch. But it left very little time for me to prepare him for questions. So as he's walking to the briefing room, I'm like, Mr. President, listen, here, I know what you're going to be asked today. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, Dr. Fauci went on TV, of course, on CNN, and suggested, if you would have started mitigation earlier, maybe we could have saved more lives. And the press is going nuts, saying President Trump didn't save as many lives as he could have. And he goes, okay, Kaylee, well, what would you say to that question? And I was a meticulous watcher of the coronavirus task force briefings. I always took notes. If my family walked in the room, they knew I would say pause until everyone was quiet so I could continue my note-taking. So I had all the facts in my head that day, and I said, Mr. President, here's how I'd respond. On January 6th, there was not a single confirmed case of COVID-19. You issued a travel notice for Wuhan. January 17th, not a single case of COVID-19 in this country. You began public health screenings at 3 major international airports. January 21st, there was just one case reported. What did your CDC do? You activated an emergency operations center. And on January 31st, not a single U.S. COVID death, and you issued a travel ban on China, one that your political opponent called xenophobic. And he said to me, Kaylee, go write that down. So I ran back to my office, I typed it up for him, and President Trump was not someone to read scripted answers. He's the commander-in-chief. He knows what his administration's doing. He's the one calling the shots. He doesn't need, a list of reporters, for example. Although we did give him a seating chart, so he could pick and choose, but not a list of call on this person, this person, this person. So I go back, I type it up for him, and in one of the rare instances I can remember, the president actually read word for word what I had written down, and I thought to myself, day one was a victory in the White House, despite the nervousness getting there. But, at that point, I didn't know if I myself would ever go to the podium. It had been 400 days since a press secretary had ever stood behind the podium. So I didn't know if that day would come. But one day, out of the blue, President Trump looked at me and goes, Kaylee, I want you to go to the podium. I said, okay. And I think I know why he said that. He used to watch, and I had this notebook, and I would write little personal notes, and it ended up being like very neat, but very small handwriting, and the page did look really kind of impressive, I guess. So the president said, let me see that notebook. So I showed him, and he's like, look at these beautiful notes. And anytime he would have like senators come, governors, he'd be like, Kaylee, hold up that notebook, hold it up. And he loved it, like a proud father. But I think it gave him faith I could actually do it. So I went to the podium. I was preparing to go to the podium, and I thought, I need to give myself 2 weeks. I really want to have all my facts together. And then he kept saying, go to the podium, go to the podium. And on Thursday, he said something to the effect of, go to the podium and do it before Monday, meaning I had, essentially 36 hours to get this done. But I had a great team that helped me. We prepared. We came up with the binder, some of you may remember, perfectly tabbed. So much so that there was a camera run by the White House Correspondents Association over my shoulder that would take pictures of the binder. And it was a marvel to CNN. They wrote this headline, Decoding the Mysteries of Kayleigh McEnany's Briefing Book. And we thought about doing a head fake one day. Instead of having like therapeutics and COVID and vaccine, we'd have like John Carl, Jim Acosta, Caitlin Collins, just to keep them honest. We didn't do that, but it's a regret of mine. But my point in telling you all this is I was very prepared for that first press briefing from a human standpoint. I had done all the right things. I'd prepared. Even from a spiritual standpoint, that morning I listened to a Joyce Meyer sermon about faith over fear. I prayed. I listened to my Christian music. I tweeted out Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But I was still a bit of a mess when I went to the White House, just paralyzed with fear and nervousness. And it was my predecessor, another woman of faith, Sarah Sanders, a great young woman. She sent me a piece of advice. And yes, she deserves a big clap. She was great. She sent me a list of advice, and the final piece of advice she sent me was this: most importantly, pray. Let God carry you through the tough times, give you strength when you don't have any wisdom. And she told me that before each of her press briefings, she read a Jesus Calling devotional. I had a Jesus Calling of my own that my husband had given me when we were first dating. And so I carried on that tradition. But on that day of my first briefing, May 1st, 2020, she sent me her Jesus Calling devotional from exactly 2 years prior, May 1st, 2018. And it said this: you are on the path of my choosing. There is no randomness about your life. As you give yourself more and more to a life of constant communion with me, you will realize that you simply have no time to worry. But I worried that day, to the point where I was crying at the time my press briefing was supposed to start. My assistant, Lindy, who's actually here, she was my assistant in the White House, ran in, Kaylee, you need to be out there at the podium. You can't be in here crying. She put my parents on speakerphone. We all prayed together. I went to the West Wing bathroom. They have this private, beautiful little bathroom, actually, right outside the press secretary's office, and I got on my knees, and I prayed. And then I went back, I saw the president. He was in his private dining room surrounded by Jared Kushner, Mark Meadows, Vice President Mike Pence, and Vice President Mike Pence went like this to me and said Philippians 4:13, the same verse I had tweeted, and he said, I've been praying for you. And I can tell you this, when I went to the podium, The world didn't know I went from tears in my office to total and complete serenity. I felt like I had been there my whole life, and it was not because of anything I had done, but it was because of millions of Christians around this country, not just praying for me, but praying for the entire administration. And I can tell you, we felt your prayers. And I want to personally thank you for all of you who prayed for the president, because we felt it. We felt them through the ups and the downs. One of the scariest days, I can tell you, in the White House was October 1st, 2020, or it was really the day after. But before I get to what happened on that day, there was another important day, and I believe good and evil are constantly battling, and Jesus Christ is here, and we know how the story's written. We know who wins in the end, but that doesn't mean that Satan isn't lurking around. We know that. That's embedded in the Bible, trying to find his next victim to devour. And indeed, that dynamic played out in the White House. And September 26, 2020 was one of those days. I remember I walked down the National Mall. That's where all the Smithsonian museums are, the monuments. And I walked down the National Mall with my mom, with my daughter. It was the day of the National Prayer March. And there's something special when you're in the nation's capital and you're walking and you can just feel fall in the air, almost here, and you hear sermons and you hear prayer trickling through the streets of our nation's capital. So I left that day to go from my house, I think it was a Saturday, to the White House, to the West Wing, because it was an important day. It was the day that the president was nominating Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. It was a big day. So I walk in, and Franklin Graham, who was a big part of the National Prayer March, I turn the corner, running to my office a little late, and I see Franklin Graham standing there, and I see Jensen Franklin, and I see all of these great pastors who were just going in to meet with the president. Franklin Graham was hugely important during COVID-19. He gave that beautiful Easter 2020 message where he said this, the storm, and it was in Central Park, so it was really, as we were all so fearful of what was going to happen, he had set up these makeshift hospital tents in Central Park, and he gave a sermon that they broadcast on Fox, and he said this, that storm that you're going through, God doesn't give us a pass. If you come to Christ, you don't get some kind of pass where you don't go through storms. No, you still have storms in life. You'll still have viruses or whatever comes down our path in life, but he promises to be with us. He'll guide us. He'll direct us. He'll never leave or forsake us if you put your faith in Jesus Christ. So that was the message he gave as COVID was hitting, and I see him as I turn the corner going into the West Wing, and I ask him if he'll come to my office. Lindy and I were big fans of his, and we took a picture with him. He goes in to meet with the president, and then we go to the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett out in the Rose Garden, and if you'll remember, the Rose Garden event was the event where COVID-19 was allegedly lurking among the staff. You know, Fauci called it the super spreader event. I ended up getting COVID. A bunch of my staff did. The President of the United States did, Hope Hicks did. So who knows if that was the point at which it occurred, but I will say that there's something to be said for just the symbol of good, Franklin Graham and all of these great pastors who had just met with the president, who then proceeds to go out to the Rose Garden where evil is literally lurking. They're constantly battling one another. And that's why this verse, I think says it all. 1 Peter 5:8, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy prowls around you like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. That was September 26th. On October 1st, I'm watching my boss, the President of the United States, live on TV. He's on Sean Hannity's show. And I get a call from the Chief of Staff's office. President of the United States just tested positive for COVID-19. I was stunned. I was startled. I was scared. I mean, who knew how President Trump would be able to handle this virus? We know that it's plagued so many of our brothers and sisters here in America and across the world. And I said, does the president know he's positive as he's on live television? And the Chief of Staff's office said, we're not really sure, but the person who called me wasn't really sure if he knew or not. I'm sure the Chief of Staff did. But he said, we're waiting on a second confirmatory test. Write up a tweet that says the president got COVID. So I did just that. And I went to the West Wing the next day, and no one was there. It was like people had been told not to come in, but my team still came in. It was eerie. It was scary being in a situation where you had an Oval Office without a president in the Oval Office, although that could be a norm these days, I don't know. But it was very scary at that time. It was a scary moment, but thank goodness the president recovered. And I'll tell you, and I recovered too. I was asymptomatic, thank goodness. But what was really special to me, people say, what was like one of the most special or moving times you had in the administration? And I can tell you it's when we all had recovered from COVID and we went to the International Church of Las Vegas, beautiful church, much like the one I grew up in, Southern Baptist Church. You have great music, much like this church. They had all flags from all across the world hanging above us. And, I go to church on Sundays with my family, but I'd never gotten to go to church with the President of the United States. So it was pretty cool to be able to sit in that pew and him sit beside me. But lyrics that I heard so moved me in a way that I hadn't been moved. And they were lyrics I'd heard for so long. Lyrics like, I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe you'll do it again. You make a way where there is no way. Those lyrics just hit my ears as if I was hearing them for the first time. And I heard a new song in that moment called New Wine, and it's a song about the crushing and the pressing and how that process yields this beautiful product of wine, and the crushing and the pressing in your life and the crushing and the pressing our nation went through and is still going through with COVID and the protests that we've seen and just some of the discord and where it feels so divisive. All of that crushing and pressing can bring something new and beautiful and great if we turn our eyes to the Lord. So that service meant a lot, particularly after we went through a hard time in the White House. But let me say this, and I do this wherever I speak just because I believe accountability is very important, especially for the media. And some of the stories that were told during the Trump administration, many months out, have proven to just simply not be true. And I think it's important to share those and to have facts, because the press doesn't change their headlines, but I think it's important to point out when they've been proven wrong. And they have been a few times. I don't know if you remember Lafayette Square. The prevailing narrative was this from NPR: peaceful protesters tear gas to clear a way for Trump to take a church photo op. You remember the photo of him holding the Bible at St. John's Church. Well, that was the headline, and there were many others like it. Washington Post wrote, "Inside the push to tear gas protesters ahead of a Trump photo op." The Washington Post also said, "From Tiananmen Square to Lafayette Square." They literally compared the two. And then there was this question from Jim Acosta: if the White House, the president, and his team had to do it all over again, would you have gassed and pummeled protesters to clear the park so the president could have a photo op? Well, fast forward 9 months later, the Inspector General of the Department of Interior, Inspector General, not a right-wing news source, Inspector General, we determined that the evidence did not support a finding that the U.S. Park Police cleared the park on June 1st, 2020, so the president could enter the park. So it just simply wasn't true. Then you go to the Russia bounty story. This one was so personal because it was such a hurtful narrative from the New York Times that Russia had bounties on the heads of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and President Trump did nothing about it. That was the story. And I stood at the podium and I said, this is not verified. There's no consensus in the intelligence community. In fact, there are dissenting views on this intelligence. And I warned, before buying into something, a narrative from the New York Times that falsely states something about the president, wait for the facts to come out. But they did not wait. In fact, you had President Biden accusing President Trump of dereliction of duty. You had President Trump accused of treason. The New York Times, and this was so sick to me, even convinced military families, Gold Star families that had lost their son or daughter in war, the highest sacrifice someone could make, convinced these families that the death of their loved one was likely because of this intelligence and President Trump not acting about it. I mean, think about that. I can't imagine the pain of a Gold Star family, and I can't imagine how much more that's compounded if you think it was preventable from a commander-in-chief. Well, here we are 10 months later, and President Biden's intelligence community, his intelligence community, found this, as summed up by the left-wing Daily Beast. U.S. intelligence walks back claim that Russians put bounties on American troops. It was a huge election time story that prompted cries of treason, but according to a newly disclosed assessment, Donald Trump might have been right to call it a hoax. It's amazing. And it goes on and on. The COVID-19 lab leak theory, that one was, President Trump suggested maybe COVID originated in a lab in Wuhan where they were working on coronavirus. It seems like it could be logical, but not to USA Today. They said this: Trump says U.S. investigating whether coronavirus spread after China lab mishap, but cites no evidence. NPR went so far as to say scientists debunked the lab accident theory of pandemic emergence. Washington Post, fact checker, said, was the new coronavirus accidentally released from a Wuhan lab? It's doubtful. There was CNN, Anthony Fauci just crushed Donald Trump's theory on the origins of the coronavirus. 1 year later, Washington Post how the Wuhan lab leak theory suddenly became credible, just suddenly. So if you're catching a trend here, you should. But look, we're at a crossroads as a country, and it's so much bigger than even Democrat conservative. It is basic cultural norms that we all used to agree on, and a radical force that is trying to change them. And as people of faith, we're under attack more than anyone. But you look at our police officers, our heroes, and thank you to the officers who are here today, to our law enforcement. You know, I rode through the streets of D.C. After a riot last year, and they had spray painted on the Veteran Affairs sign, ACAB, all cops are, and I won't repeat that word. We're under attack when our police officers are treated so horribly. Defund the police, a prevailing narrative of the left. Socialism is being embraced like never before. Anti-Semitism in the halls of Congress. Some of the things that have been said by members of the squad are just sickening about our Jewish brothers and sisters. It's unacceptable. And then Afghanistan, which I think was a real turning point for our country, where the Taliban were called, quote, our Afghan partners by the Biden administration. I don't think so. And the church, the Christian church in Afghanistan, I've done a lot of research and reading about that, about Christians who have chosen to stay, despite knowing what they are up against with a radical Taliban regime that will do who knows what to them should they be found. But they chose to stay because saving men and women for Christ in Afghanistan is their calling, and God bless them for doing so. But we used to have a phrase in this country, leave no man behind. But we left men and women behind in Afghanistan. And then our 13 servicemen and women, those heroes, those beautiful heroes who were left at Kabul airport in a situation they should have never been in, and they won't be with their families this Christmas, one of whom left a newborn child who was born just 2 weeks after he perished and gave his life so heroically in that attack. But beyond even foreign policy and what we're seeing there, our nation's greatest symbols are under attack, one of which is the church. And I'll never forget when, after the murder of George Floyd, some of the protests that ensued, some of whom were protesting truly because they wanted to have their voice heard, but some of whom took those protests and turned them violent. And one of the symbols that came under attack in one of those violent protests was St. John's Church. And I'll never forget, it's this beautiful little church across from the White House. And at 10:30 p.m., Kevin Corke of Fox News reported that St. John's Church was lit on fire. And I just simply didn't believe it until I turned on my TV and saw this church lit ablaze. And this was a church built in 1815. It's called the Church of the Presidents because every single president, going back to James Madison, had attended a service in that famous yellow church. On top of it is a bell, a 1,000-pound bell. It was made by Paul Revere's son. And as I watched this church burn, I think to myself, what's the history behind this church? I was in a hotel room. I wasn't allowed to go back to my DC apartment. They told me that I couldn't go back to the city because there was some violence outside of my apartment. So I'm in Virginia in a hotel watching this. And I found out that St. John's Church, the rector of that church in 1963, was Reverend John C. Harper. And he was told that he had to close the church doors because there would be a bloodbath, quote, bloodbath. Why was there going to be a bloodbath on that day in 1963? Well, it was supposed to be the March on Washington, the most famous peaceful march on behalf of civil rights and equal rights that our country has ever seen. It was a peaceful march, ending in that famous I Have a Dream speech by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But Harper was told, close the doors, you can't keep them open, but he refused. And as that march was happening, that march for equal rights, these were the lyrics coming from that church. One family on earth are we, throughout our widest span, oh, help us everywhere to see the brotherhood of man. And when he was asked why he kept his church doors open in support of Martin Luther King Jr., he said this church building is open as it has always been, so all who want to worship here can. The ministry of this parish is extended to any who seek it. Our fellowship with one another has no limitations whatsoever. Think of the irony of that. This church that stayed open for equal rights, for civil rights, was now lit aflame by rioters who were saying they wanted equal rights, civil rights, but were burning the very church that stood so heroically on behalf of civil rights. Our churches are under attack. Our American flag is under attack when you have a New York Times editorial board member who says she's disturbed when she sees the American flag. Macy Gray called it tattered, divisive, and incorrect. A U.S. Olympic Committee, apparently they're making plans to redesign it. and you had a U.S. alternate in the Olympics say she wanted to win a medal, not so she could put that flag around her shoulders, but so that she could burn it. We are at a crossroads in this country, which is why it's so important, more important than ever, for Christians to have their voice heard. And look, those words, for such a time as this, they were meant for me to hear, but they were meant for us all to hear. And a verse that sticks with me, a very hard day in the White House, my assistant, Lindy, instead of giving me my daily schedule, she wrote for me a Bible verse, and it was 2 Corinthians 4:17. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us a greater glory that far outweighs them all. Put your eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And so whatever you're going through today, a sickness, cancer, divisiveness in your family, marital issues, just know, focus on what is unseen, because that is ultimately what will achieve for us eternal glory. And know this, just as my dad said to me, and Van Jones, we're at a divisive point in this country, I know that, Republicans, Democrats, there's something so much bigger, and that's being a Christian and a believer in Jesus Christ. And if you put your faith in Jesus Christ, the same way he used me for such a time as this, he indeed will use you for such a time as this, because you're here in this place at Marcus Point Baptist Church in Pensacola, Florida, and whatever your life circumstance is, for a reason. But turn your eyes to Jesus and just know, just as I was made for such a time as this, so too are you made for such a time as this. Thank you so much.